Here's a paradox that should stop you cold. The United States just launched its largest military operation in Latin America since the Cold War. 150 aircraft, thousands of troops, strikes across an entire nation, and called it a law enforcement action. An arrest. They captured a president, bombed military installations, disabled a national power grid, and framed it as serving a warrant. The narco-terrorism justification sounds compelling until you remember the same administration just pardoned a president convicted of trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine into America. The stated reasons dissolve under 30 seconds of scrutiny. This isn't a story about heroes and villains. It's an anatomy of how empires acquire resources while speaking the language of justice. Let me show you what was really purchased with those missiles. Nicolas Maduro was 15 feet from survival when time ran out, at 2:01 a.m. Caracas time as American helicopters descended on his compound, and gunfire erupted across the grounds. He sprinted toward a steel safe room door, the kind that takes 47 seconds to breach, even with military-grade explosives. He reached it. He grabbed the handle. And then, American Special Forces were on him so fast, he couldn't pull it closed. 15 feet and a fraction of a second separated the president of Venezuela from a completely different outcome. By dawn, he was on the USS Iwo Jima heading toward a Brooklyn detention center, where he would await trial on charges that legal scholars across the political spectrum have called unprecedented. Imagine that scene for a moment. Picture the visual one of the most fortified compounds in South America, darkness imposed by American cyber attacks that shut down the Caracas power grid helicopters, coming in at 100 feet over water to avoid radar, and a man racing for a door he would never close. A presidency ended in the time between reaching for a handle and pulling it shut. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles away, a very different scene was unfolding. Margaret Chen was sitting in the executive lounge at Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport when her phone lit up with the first Reuters alert. At 53, she'd spent 26 years in energy sector mergers and acquisitions, and she recognized immediately what this moment meant. Her firm had been quietly accumulating positions in heavy crude refining capacity for months, ever since the military buildup in the Caribbean became impossible to ignore. By the time she landed in Calgary, 6 hours later, those positions had appreciated by $23 million. She didn't celebrate. She sent one text to her managing partner. Phase 2 begins. Here's the first question worth sitting with. How did Margaret know to position her firm before the missiles flew? The answer isn't insider trading or classified intelligence. It's pattern recognition. The USS Gerald Ford Carrier Group had been in the Caribbean since November. American forces had been seizing Venezuelan oil tankers for weeks. Over 35 airstrikes on vessels in the region since September. 15,000 troops deployed in what the Pentagon called Operation Southern Spear. The information was public. The interpretation was rare. Now let me show you someone who didn't have access to that interpretation. Carlos Venegas still remembers the exact moment his life split in two. He was working the night shift at a water treatment facility on the outskirts of Maracaibo when the power died. At 44, he'd spent 18 years keeping clean water flowing to 400,000 people through economic collapse, through hyperinflation, through shortages of every chemical and spare part imaginable. He'd learned to improvise, but you can't improvise electricity. The backup generators had fuel for 6 hours. After that, the pumps would stop. The pressure would drop. The water would become unsafe. Carlos stood in the darkness of his control room listening to American aircraft overhead and did the math. By noon, nearly 500,000 people would be without clean water. By nightfall, the first cases of waterborne illness would begin. He called his supervisor. No answer. He called the Emergency Operations Center. No answer. He called his wife to tell her to fill every container in the house. That call went through. Carlos and Margaret experienced the same event. One lost access to the systems that made his life's work meaningful. The other gained $23 million in portfolio value. The difference wasn't intelligence or luck. It was position in the information hierarchy, in the economic structure, in the architecture of who benefits when power is exercised and who absorbs the costs. But here's what most people get wrong about this story. They see it as a military operation, a foreign policy decision, something happening over there that doesn't touch their daily lives. This is an economic restructuring with military characteristics, and the economics were stated openly in plain English from the White House podium. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. That's not subtext. That's not inference. That's the President of the United States announcing on camera that American corporations will now extract Venezuelan resources from a country the U.S. military invaded hours earlier. They stole our oil. We built that whole industry there, and they just took it over like we were nothing. The framing is remarkable. Venezuelan oil from Venezuelan soil nationalized by the Venezuelan government is described as stolen American property, the largest theft of property in the history of our country. Here's the second question to carry with you. When a nation nationalizes its own natural resources, who exactly is the thief? The answer depends entirely on whose interests you're calculating. For American oil companies that built extraction infrastructure in Venezuela decades ago, nationalization felt like theft. For Venezuelans who watched those profits flow north while their population remained poor, nationalization felt like sovereignty. Both perspectives are internally consistent. Neither is objectively true. What is objectively true is this. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest on Earth, 18% of all known oil, and as of January 2026, American military forces control access to those reserves, while American corporations prepare to extract them. The word for that used to be conquest. We just don't use that word anymore. Roberto Mendez understood this dynamic better than most. At 61, he'd spent his entire career as a petroleum engineer in Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. He'd watched the industry rise under foreign investment, transform under nationalization, and decay under sanctions and mismanagement. When the American strikes began, he was sitting in his apartment in Caracas, already preparing. Not preparing to resist, preparing to collaborate. Roberto had skills that the incoming American operators would desperately need, decades of knowledge about Venezuelan fields, infrastructure, and logistics that couldn't be learned from satellite imagery. Within 72 hours of the invasion, he would receive a call from a contractor working with Chevron. Within a week, his salary would triple. Within a month, he would be training American engineers on systems he'd built. He told me later that he felt no guilt about the decision. The oil was going to flow regardless. The only question was whether my family would benefit or starve. That calculation, survival over loyalty, pragmatism over principle, is being made by thousands of Venezuelans right now. The occupation will need collaborators. The economy will need workers. The extraction will need expertise. And people like Roberto will provide it, because the alternative is watching their families suffer while the resources flow north anyway. Meanwhile, in a hospital in eastern Caracas, a surgeon named Isabella Torres was performing emergency surgery by flashlight. The power grid hadn't just affected water treatment plants. It had shut down hospitals, ventilators, dialysis machines, and operating rooms across the capital. Isabella, 39 years old with 15 years of experience, was removing shrapnel from a security guard who'd been caught in the crossfire at a military installation. She had no anesthesiologist. He couldn't make it through the chaos in the streets. She had no proper lighting, just 3 cell phones held by nurses. She had no certainty that her patient would survive, just the knowledge that he would definitely die if she didn't try. She saved him. He was one of the lucky ones. The official American casualty report was triumphant. Not a single American service member was killed, and not a single piece of American equipment was lost. General Raisin Kane called it an operation that only the United States military could undertake. Venezuelan casualties weren't mentioned. Venezuelan infrastructure damage wasn't mentioned. The 47 seconds it would have taken to breach Maduro's safe room door was described in detail. The hours it would take for water systems to fail was not. Two countries experienced the same night. One measured success in equipment preserved. The other would measure it in hospital beds filled in waterborne illnesses, contracted in a slow accumulation of suffering that doesn't make for good television. Because that's what this was according to the man who ordered it. President Trump described watching the operation as being like a television show, something he found very impressive. He said he wasn't sure if the public would ever get to see it, but that it was an incredible thing to see. The President of the United States watched a military invasion as entertainment. And somewhere in that sentence is everything you need to know about what kind of system produces this outcome. But the operation itself, spectacular as it was, is only the beginning of the story. What comes next will determine whether this is a surgical intervention or the opening act of a generational occupation. And the people positioning themselves for that occupation are already 3 moves ahead of everyone watching the news. The people positioning themselves for that occupation are already 3 moves ahead of everyone watching the news. And to understand their playbook, you need to understand a doctrine that's been shaping this hemisphere for 200 years. In 1823, President James Monroe declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization. Any foreign power that tried to extend influence into the Americas would face American opposition. This Monroe Doctrine established a simple principle. What happens in this hemisphere is America's business. Trump referenced this doctrine explicitly from the White House podium. But he added something revealing. The Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot. They now call it the Donroe Document. That wasn't a joke. It was an announcement. The original Monroe Doctrine said the hemisphere was off-limits to foreign powers. The Trump corollary says America will directly administer countries within it. Think of it like the difference between a landlord who tells other landlords to stay off his property and a landlord who moves into his tenants' apartments and starts rearranging their furniture. Same building, completely different relationship to the people living inside. To understand how we got from one to the other, you need to understand the resource that makes Venezuela different from every other country in the region. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than any nation on Earth, roughly 18% of all known oil. And for most of the 20th century, American companies extracted that oil. American refineries processed it, and American consumers benefited from the arrangement. Then came Hugo Chavez. Elena Vasquez remembers the exact moment the old order began to crack. At 26, she was working as a translator for an American oil company in Maracaibo when Chavez won the 1998 election. Her American supervisors were worried but optimistic. Surely the new president would understand that foreign investment was essential to the industry. Within 3 years, Elena was out of a job. The company had withdrawn. The nationalization had begun. Chavez didn't just nationalize Venezuelan oil, he redirected it. Instead of flowing north to American refineries, Venezuelan crude began flowing east to China. Beijing invested over $60 billion in Venezuelan infrastructure ports and extraction facilities. Every barrel committed to China was a barrel removed from American supply chains. This wasn't just about money. It was about architecture, the architecture of who controls resources and who depends on them. Here's a simple way to think about it. Imagine you own a restaurant, and for decades you've had an exclusive deal with a particular farm. You've built your entire menu around their produce. Your kitchen is designed for their ingredients. Your staff is trained on their products. Then one day that farm announces they're selling exclusively to a competitor across town. You can find other farms, but rebuilding your kitchen, retraining your staff, redesigning your menu that takes years and costs millions. In the meantime, your competitor is serving dishes you can't replicate. American Gulf Coast refineries faced exactly this problem. Over 60% of U.S. refinery capacity was specifically engineered to process heavy sour crude, the kind Venezuela produces. You can't simply substitute light sweet crude from American shale fields. The chemistry doesn't work. The equipment doesn't match. Refineries are calibrated machines, not flexible kitchens. When Venezuelan oil stopped flowing, North American refineries had to source heavy crude from Canada, Mexico, and the Middle East, paying premium prices for a product they used to get cheaper from next door. Remember Margaret Chen from Part 1, the executive whose firm made $23 million positioning for the invasion? She'd been studying this refinery mismatch for years. Her insight was simple. Whoever controlled Venezuelan heavy crude controlled the leverage point in American refining. And whoever controlled the leverage point would profit enormously from any resolution of the standoff. Here's the first question worth examining. If nationalization hurt American companies, why didn't previous administrations do what Trump just did? The answer reveals something important about how power actually operates. Previous administrations used economic warfare instead of military warfare. Sanctions in 2017 targeting Venezuelan officials. Broader sanctions in 2019 targeting the oil industry itself. Asset freezes. Banking restrictions. The explicit goal was to make Venezuela's economy so painful that Maduro would fall without American troops firing a shot. It didn't work. And here's the unexpected twist: the sanctions may have made the military option inevitable. Patricia Delgado spent 20 years building an import business in Caracas before the 2019 sanctions destroyed it. At 52, she'd survived hyperinflation, currency controls, and political chaos. But she couldn't survive American banks refusing to process her transactions. The sanctions were supposed to hurt the government, she told me. They hurt everyone except the government. Maduro's people found workarounds: shell companies, cryptocurrency, Chinese banks. Regular people like me had nothing. Patricia's experience was repeated across Venezuela's private sector. The economy collapsed. Millions fled. But Maduro stayed in power, increasingly dependent on China, Russia, and Iran for survival. This created a paradox that Washington couldn't resolve through economic pressure alone. The more America sanctioned Venezuela, the more Venezuela depended on American adversaries. The more Venezuela depended on American adversaries, the more it became a strategic threat rather than just an economic nuisance. By 2025, Venezuela wasn't just selling oil to China. It was hosting Iranian military advisors. It was providing sanctuary for what Washington called terrorist organizations. It was, in Trump's words, increasingly hosting foreign adversaries in our region and acquiring menacing offensive weapons. The economic warfare had pushed Venezuela into exactly the arms America feared most. Now here's what most people get wrong about the military option. They assume it was always the plan, that the sanctions were just pretexts building toward invasion. That's too simple. The truth is messier. Sanctions were supposed to work. When they didn't, policymakers faced a choice: accept failure and the strategic consequences, or escalate to methods that might succeed but would carry different risks. Different people in different positions made different calculations. Marco Rubio made one calculation. As Secretary of State, he'd spent his entire political career obsessed with leftist governments in Latin America. Cuba was his origin story. Venezuela was his white whale. He saw the military option not as escalation, but as opportunity, a chance to accomplish what decades of economic pressure had failed to achieve. General David Raisin Kane made a different calculation. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his job was to plan operations that could succeed militarily, regardless of whether they should be ordered politically. He spent months studying Maduro's movements, his security arrangements, what he ate, what he wore, what were his pets. The military machine was ready. Whether to use it was someone else's decision. And Donald Trump made the final calculation. His was perhaps the simplest. They stole our oil. We didn't do anything about it. I would have done something about it. 3 perspectives, 3 calculations, 1 outcome. Let me show you how those calculations played out for someone caught in between. Fernando Ruiz was 34 years old, an engineer at PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, when the sanctions began squeezing production. He'd watched the infrastructure decay, pipelines corroding pumps, failing skilled workers, fleeing to Colombia and the United States. By 2025, Venezuela was producing barely 1 million barrels a day from reserves that could support 5 times that volume. Fernando knew the technical problems intimately. He also knew the solutions: billions in investment, modern equipment, foreign expertise. The sanctions made all of that impossible. When American forces struck, Fernando had a choice similar to Roberto Mendez from Part 1. Resist and watch his skills become worthless in a collapsed economy, or collaborate and become part of the reconstruction that American companies would lead. He chose collaboration. Within 2 weeks, he was consulting for Halliburton. His salary went from $200 a month in devalued bolivars to $8, $500 a month in US dollars. His technical knowledge of Venezuelan fields made him invaluable. "I didn't betray my country," he told me. "My country's leadership betrayed the oil industry. The Americans are just picking up the pieces." That rationalization that collaboration is pragmatism, not betrayal, is the psychological infrastructure of every occupation. It allows skilled people to participate in systems they might otherwise oppose. It allows extractive arrangements to function with local expertise. It allows conquest to wear the face of reconstruction. Here's the second question to carry forward. If American companies are rebuilding Venezuelan oil infrastructure, who owns what they build? Trump was explicit about this. American companies will spend billions of dollars and be reimbursed for everything. The oil revenues will cover the investment costs, reimburse America for the damages caused us by that country, and provide money for the Venezuelan people in that order. Picture a visual representation of where the money flows from Venezuelan ground to American corporate balance sheets, with some percentage trickling back to Venezuelan citizens, mediated by American administrators who will decide what proper and judicious looks like. This is the mechanism. Not conspiracy, not secret plots, just openly stated economic arrangements backed by military force. But mechanisms need operators. Someone has to administer a country of 28 million people. Someone has to keep the lights on the water flowing, the hospitals functioning. Someone has to manage the transition from Maduro's government to whatever comes next. When asked who would run Venezuela, Trump pointed to the people standing behind him: Rubio, Hegseth, and others in the military, cabinet members, political appointees, people with no constitutional authority over foreign territory, no experience governing civilian populations, no legal framework for the powers they would exercise. "We're going to run it properly," Trump said. "We're going to run it professionally." But running a country isn't a press conference. It's a million daily decisions about electricity and sewage and food distribution and security and courts and contracts and 100 other systems that most people never think about until they stop working. Carlos Venegas, the water treatment operator from Part 1, whose facility went dark during the invasion, knows this better than any cabinet secretary. The water system he maintained served 400,000 people. It required constant attention, chemical balancing pressure, monitoring pump maintenance, emergency repairs. One person can't do it alone. It takes teams, supply chains, institutional knowledge, and infrastructure that functions. None of that was addressed in the White House announcement. The spectacular military operation was described in loving detail. The mundane work of actually governing was waved away with promises of professionalism. This gap between the drama of seizure and the drudgery of administration is where occupations succeed or fail. The American military excels at breaking things. It has a much more complicated record at building them. And that record was about to be tested in the largest American occupation of the Western Hemisphere since the Spanish-American War. The question wasn't whether Venezuela would be run by Americans. That was already decided. The question was whether it would be run competently, and who would pay the price if it wasn't. The question wasn't whether Venezuela would be run by Americans. That was already decided. The question was whether it would be run competently, and who would pay the price if it wasn't. Let me show you what competence looks like from the perspective of the people who planned this operation and what it looks like from the ground where the consequences landed. General David Raisin Kane stood at the White House podium and delivered a briefing that would make any military strategist proud. Months of preparation. Intelligence gathering so detailed they knew what Maduro ate, what he wore, what his pets were. Over 150 aircraft launching from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere. F-22s, F-35s, F-18s, B-1 bombers, drones, electronic warfare platforms. Thousands of flight hours of experience. The youngest crew member was 20 years old. The oldest was 49. Not to get it right, the general said, but to ensure that we cannot get it wrong. The helicopters flew at 100 feet above water to avoid radar detection. Cyber attacks disabled Venezuelan air defenses and shut down the Caracas power grid. At 2:01 a.m. local time, the extraction force descended into Maduro's compound within the general's words: speed, precision, and discipline. Helicopters took fire. One was hit, but remained flyable. The force returned fire with overwhelming force in self-defense. By 3:29 a.m., they were over water with prisoners aboard. Picture this visual: a command room somewhere in the Caribbean screens showing real-time feeds from multiple aircraft generals and cabinet members watching as green dots moved across a digital map of Caracas, every element choreographed like a symphony of violence. The president watching it like a television show. Secretary Hegseth calling it sheer guts and grit, gallantry and glory. This was competence in the language of power, precision, integration, lethality. The operation was by every military metric a stunning success. Now, let me show you what success looked like on the other side of those screens. Adriana Morales was 23 years old working the night shift at a call center in eastern Caracas when the power died. She wasn't near any military installation. She wasn't involved in politics. She was answering customer service calls for a Colombian telecommunications company, one of the few jobs in Venezuela that still paid in dollars. When the lights went out, Adriana assumed it was another routine blackout. Venezuela's grid had been failing for years. She waited for the backup generators. They didn't kick in. She checked her phone. No signal. She walked outside and saw something that stopped her breathing. The entire city was dark. Not a rolling blackout. Not a neighborhood outage. Caracas, a city of 3 million people, had gone completely black. Then she heard the helicopters. Adriana spent the next 6 hours hiding in the call center bathroom, listening to explosions and gunfire in the distance, unable to contact her mother, who lived alone on the other side of the city. She didn't know if her neighborhood had been hit. She didn't know if her mother was alive. She knew nothing except that her country was being invaded, and she was crouched on a tile floor in the dark, waiting for morning. Her mother was fine. The military strikes were precise as advertised. But precision means something different when you're watching green dots on a screen versus when you're listening to explosions and wondering if your family is dead. Here's what most people get wrong about precision warfare. They assume it means minimal suffering. It doesn't. It means targeted suffering. The people in the crosshairs die or get captured. The people adjacent to the crosshairs experience terror, displacement, and trauma that doesn't appear in any operational briefing. The Caracas power grid wasn't accidentally disabled. It was deliberately attacked, part of what the military called layering different effects provided by Spacecom, Cybercom, and other members of the interagency. Shutting down electricity to a city of 3 million people was a tactical choice that made the helicopter approach safer. The calculation was explicit American pilot safety versus Venezuelan civilian infrastructure. American pilots won. Every dialysis patient whose machine stopped working lost. Every premature infant in an incubator lost. Every surgery interrupted mid-procedure lost. But those losses weren't reported from the White House podium. Not a single American service member was killed, and not a single piece of American equipment was lost. That was the metric of success. Venezuelan casualties weren't mentioned because they weren't being measured. Pause this video for a moment and sit with that asymmetry. One side counts every helicopter, every bullet, every American life with obsessive precision. The other side, 28 million people, exists as backdrop. Scenery in the television show the president was watching. This is the rage moment. This is where the system reveals itself. Because the same administration that launched 150 aircraft to capture one man in operation, requiring thousands of personnel, billions in equipment, months of planning, had no plan for what would happen to Venezuelan hospitals when the power went out. They knew Maduro's pets. They didn't know how many people were on ventilators in Caracas. That's not incompetence. That's priority. The operation was designed to achieve American objectives with minimum American cost. Venezuelan costs were externalities unfortunate, but acceptable collateral in pursuit of larger goals. Now let me show you the second layer of what running a country actually means. Remember, Carlos Venegas from Part 1. The water treatment operator whose facility went dark. By noon on the day of the invasion, his worst fears had materialized. The pumps had stopped, the pressure had dropped. 400,000 people were without clean water, and there was nothing he could do about it. Carlos called everyone he could think of. His supervisors were unreachable. The Emergency Operations Center was overwhelmed. The American forces were focused on military targets, not civilian infrastructure. For 72 hours, his neighborhood relied on water stored in tanks, bathtubs, and whatever containers people had thought to fill. On the third day, American military engineers arrived to assess the damage. They were competent professional and had absolutely no idea how Venezuelan water systems worked. Different equipment, different chemicals, different maintenance protocols. Carlos spent 6 hours explaining systems he could have repaired in one if anyone had asked him first. They wanted to help, Carlos told me. But helping isn't the same as understanding. They saw broken infrastructure. They didn't see the years of improvisation that kept it running despite everything. Here's the first question to consider. When you run a country, do you run the systems that exist or impose new systems on top of old ones? The American approach was replacement, not restoration. New equipment, new protocols, new chains of command, efficient on paper, disruptive in practice. Venezuelan engineers who'd kept systems alive through a decade of sanctions suddenly found themselves sidelined, their expertise dismissed as the product of a failed regime. American contractors who'd never seen Venezuelan infrastructure arrived with blueprints designed for Houston and tried to apply them to Maracaibo. The results were predictable. Some systems improved dramatically, where American resources could be fully deployed. Other systems collapsed completely, where the transition from Venezuelan to American management created gaps that neither side could fill. But here's the unexpected twist. Some Venezuelans benefited enormously from the chaos. Remember Fernando Ruiz from Part 2, the PDVSA engineer who chose collaboration. Within a month of the invasion, his consulting income had made him one of the wealthiest people in his neighborhood. He drove an American contractor's SUV. He ate at restaurants that accepted dollars. He sent his children to a private school that had somehow kept its generators running throughout the crisis. Fernando wasn't alone. A whole class of Venezuelans, those with technical skills, English fluency, and the willingness to work with occupying forces, found themselves suddenly elevated. The occupation needed them. It paid accordingly. Meanwhile, Adriana Morales, the call center worker who'd hidden in a bathroom during the invasion, lost her job. The Colombian company she worked for shut down its Venezuelan operations, citing security concerns. She went from earning $400 a month to earning nothing. 2 Venezuelans, same invasion. Opposite trajectories. The system wasn't random. It rewarded certain skills and punished others. It elevated collaborators and abandoned everyone else. This is how occupations actually function. Not through universal oppression, but through selective opportunity. Some people win, most people lose, and the winners become invested in the continuation of the system that elevated them. Now let me show you the political dimension that made everything more complicated. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as president of Venezuela within hours of Maduro's capture. This created an immediate contradiction in the American narrative. Trump claimed she had a long conversation with Marco and said, "We'll do whatever you need." He described her as quite gracious and noted that she really doesn't have a choice. Rodriguez, speaking on Venezuelan state television, said something very different. Flanked by military officers, she demanded the immediate release of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. She declared that Maduro remained the only president of Venezuela. She called the political and military leadership unified and fully mobilized. Here's the second question. Who was telling the truth? The answer is probably both, depending on which conversation you're referencing. Rodriguez may have said conciliatory things to Rubio in private while saying defiant things on television. She may have been playing both sides, waiting to see which way the wind blew. She may have been under duress, saying what Americans wanted to hear while signaling resistance to her base. What's certain is that the American claim of a cooperative transition was at minimum incomplete. The Venezuelan state hadn't surrendered. It had lost its leader, but not its infrastructure. The military officers, the intelligence services, the bureaucrats who actually made the government function. Marco Rubio acknowledged this obliquely. One of the biggest problems that Venezuelans have is they have to declare independence from Cuba. They basically colonized it from a security standpoint. That reference to Cuba wasn't casual. Cuban intelligence officers had spent years embedding themselves in Venezuelan state security. When Maduro fell, they didn't disappear. They went underground. They had networks, resources, and every incentive to make the American occupation as difficult as possible. And they weren't the only ones with that incentive. Gabriel Ortiz was a colonel in Venezuelan military intelligence before the invasion. At 47, he'd spent 2 decades building networks that the American operation couldn't destroy with missiles. Safe houses, communication channels, loyal officers scattered across the military hierarchy. When the strikes began, Gabriel didn't fight. Fighting was suicide against American air power. He did something smarter. He disappeared. Within a week, Venezuelan resistance had a structure. Not a formal organization that would be too easy to detect, but a network of people who knew each other, trusted each other, and agreed on one thing: the occupation would not last forever, and those who collaborated would be remembered. Gabriel never fired a shot. He didn't have to. He simply made it known that certain people were being watched, that certain actions were being recorded, that certain collaborators would face consequences when the Americans eventually left. This is how insurgencies begin. Not with dramatic attacks, but with quiet pressure. The knowledge that survival might depend on choosing the right side, and that the right side might not be the one with the aircraft carriers. The American military understood this dynamic intellectually. They'd seen it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. They knew that capturing a leader wasn't the same as controlling a country. They knew that spectacular operations created resentment that festered for years. But knowing something and preventing it are different skills entirely. Secretary Rubio's warning at the end of the press conference was telling, "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit." That wasn't just a threat to Cuba. It was an admission that the Venezuela operation was a template. If it succeeded, if American forces could seize a country, install friendly management, and extract resources without catastrophic blowback, the same approach could be applied elsewhere. Cuba, Nicaragua, perhaps Colombia, whose President Trump had already warned to watch his ass over cocaine production. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just being enforced. It was being expanded into something that looked increasingly like direct imperial control. But empires require more than military power. They require legitimacy, some story that explains why foreign soldiers are governing people who never voted for them. And that story was already starting to crack. When reporters asked how long the U.S. would run Venezuela, Trump's answer was revealing. Well, you know, it won't cost us anything because the money coming out of the ground is very substantial. Not until democracy is restored. Not until the Venezuelan people can govern themselves. Until the oil pays for itself. The purpose was never hidden. It was stated openly from the beginning by the man who ordered the invasion. This was about resources. Everything else. The narco-terrorism charges, the gang rhetoric, the stolen election claims was narrative packaging around a resource extraction operation. The packaging was for American domestic consumption. The reality was for everyone else. And the gap between those two things was about to produce consequences that no amount of military precision could prevent. The gap between the packaging and the reality was about to produce consequences that no amount of military precision could prevent. And those consequences would unfold not in days or weeks, but across years and decades, reshaping lives in ways that the White House podium never mentioned. Countries don't collapse in spectacular moments. They erode, they decay. They die one decision at a time, one compromise at a time, one person at a time. The cameras leave, the headlines fade, and the slow work of living under occupation begins. Let me show you what that slow work looks like through the trajectories of people we've already met projected forward across 10 years of American-administered Venezuela. Adriana Morales, the 23-year-old call center worker who hid in a bathroom during the invasion, lost her job when her Colombian employer withdrew. By 2027, she had exhausted her savings, sold her furniture, and moved into her mother's two-room apartment. Her English skills, once her ticket to a middle-class salary, were useless. American contractors hired Americans. Venezuelan positions went to people with connections to the new administration. By 2030, Adriana had joined the exodus. She walked through Colombia with thousands of others, rode buses through Central America, and arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border in 2031. The same country that invaded her homeland detained her for 4 months before releasing her with an ankle monitor and a court date 3 years away. She found work cleaning houses in Phoenix, earning $11 an hour under the table, less than she'd made at the call center that employed her before the invasion. Project forward to 2036. Adriana Morales is 33 years old, undocumented, earning perhaps $23,000 a year in cash. She sends $200 a month to her mother, who still lives in the apartment in Caracas. Her English is now perfect, learned on the job, cleaning the homes of people who never ask where she came from. Her degree from a Venezuelan university is worthless. Her work history is untraceable. Her future is a series of identical days stretching forward until she gets caught or gets lucky. Now let me show you someone whose trajectory moved in the opposite direction. Fernando Ruiz, the PDVSA engineer who chose collaboration, found his technical expertise increasingly valuable as American oil companies scaled operations. By 2028, he'd been promoted to regional operations manager for a Chevron subsidiary. His salary, $145,000 per year, paid in US dollars to a Houston bank account. His children attended an international school built by the Occupation Authority. His wife shopped at stores that only accepted foreign currency. By 2030, Fernando had saved enough to buy property in Miami, a hedge against the possibility that Venezuelan politics might shift again. His network now included executives at 3 major oil companies, several American military contractors, and the occupation's economic planning office. He played golf on a course that had been a public park before the invasion. Project forward to 2036. Fernando Ruiz is 51 years old, with a net worth exceeding $2.4 million. His children are American citizens by birth, born in Miami during carefully timed visits. He speaks of Venezuela with the detachment of an investor discussing an emerging market. The country has potential, he might say, if the security situation stabilizes. Picture these two trajectories on a chart. Adriana's line slopes downward from 2026, crosses into negative territory and flatlines in poverty. Fernando's line rises steadily, accelerating as compound advantages accumulate. The same invasion, the same country. Outcomes that diverge until they're no longer recognizable as products of the same event. This divergence isn't accidental, it's structural. Every occupation creates collaborator classes who benefit from the new arrangement and resistance classes who suffer under it. The system selects for certain skills: English fluency, technical expertise, willingness to work with foreign powers, and discards everyone else. Here's what most people get wrong about occupations. They assume the occupier controls everything. They don't. They control the extraction points, the oil fields, the shipping terminals, the financial flows. Everything else they delegate, ignore, or accidentally destroy. Remember Carlos Venegas, the water treatment operator. His trajectory falls somewhere between Adriana and Fernando. By 2028, he was working for an American contractor, maintaining the same systems he'd operated before the invasion, but now at twice the salary paid in dollars. Not wealth, but stability. By 2030, Carlos had been promoted to supervisor, overseeing Venezuelan workers who did the jobs Americans didn't want to do. He was comfortable. He was complicit. He was alive. By 2036, he's 54 years old, earning $65,000 a year, wealthy by Venezuelan standards, modest by American ones. He never left the country. He never joined the resistance. He simply worked day after day, keeping water flowing to people who would never know his name. Carlos represents the vast middle of occupied populations, people who neither win dramatically nor lose catastrophically. They survive. They adapt. They participate in systems they didn't choose because the alternative is worse. Their stories don't make headlines. Their tragedies are measured in decades of diminished possibility, rather than moments of spectacular suffering. But the occupation's consequences extended far beyond individual trajectories. They reshaped the entire region. Iraq teaches this lesson. After the 2003 invasion, America spent 8 years occupying a country of 40 million people. The cost, 500 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, and over $2 trillion in direct expenditures. The result, a country more aligned with Iran than with America, a region destabilized for a generation, and the rise of ISIS from the chaos. Venezuela had one thing Iraq didn't: oil revenues that could theoretically offset occupation costs. Trump was explicit about this. It won't cost us anything because the money coming out of the ground is very substantial. But money flowing from oil fields doesn't automatically translate into functional governance. It translates into extraction resources leaving the ground and entering global markets. Where that money goes, who controls it, and how it reaches ordinary people. Those are political questions that oil revenues alone can't answer. Here's the first question worth examining. If Venezuela's oil wealth pays for the occupation, who decides how it's spent? The answer in practice was American administrators working with Venezuelan collaborators. They prioritized oil infrastructure security and payments to contractors. Schools, hospitals, and social services received whatever remained, which in the early years was not much. By 2030, Venezuelan oil production had recovered to nearly 3 million barrels per day, triple pre-invasion levels. American oil companies were extracting wealth at rates that would have seemed impossible under Maduro. But life expectancy in Venezuela had dropped by 4 years. Infant mortality had doubled. The number of Venezuelans living below the poverty line had increased from 80% to 94%. The oil was flowing. The people were dying. And the metrics of success depended entirely on which numbers you chose to count. Now let me show you someone who saw this pattern clearly from the beginning. Margaret Chen, the energy executive from Part 1, whose firm made $23 million positioning for the invasion, had expanded her operations dramatically by 2028. Her company now provided transition consulting to American corporations entering Venezuelan markets, navigating the legal complexities of operating in an occupied territory, managing relationships with occupation authorities, optimizing extraction logistics. By 2030, Margaret's firm was billing $40 million annually. Her personal income exceeded $3.2 million. She'd diversified into Colombian and Peruvian markets, anticipating that the Venezuela template might be applied elsewhere. By 2036, Margaret Chen is 63 years old, semi-retired, serving on the boards of 2 major energy companies and a think tank that advises the government on Latin American policy. Her net worth exceeds $28 million. She's never been to Venezuela. She's never met anyone like Adriana Morales. Their lives exist in parallel universes that share only a date, January 2026, when everything changed. This is the fundamental asymmetry of interventions. The benefits concentrate. The costs diffuse. Margaret's $28 million is visible, countable, deposited in accounts with her name on them. Adriana's suffering is invisible, uncounted, scattered across a continent of displaced people whose stories blur into statistics. But the consequences weren't limited to Venezuela. They rippled outward in ways that reshaped hemispheric politics. Colombia absorbed the first wave. Within 18 months of the invasion, 8 million Venezuelans had crossed into Colombian territory, adding to the 7 million who had fled during the pre-invasion crisis. Colombian social services collapsed. Border regions became ungovernable. The political backlash produced a nationalist government that closed the border and expelled refugees by force. Brazil absorbed the second wave. Venezuelans who couldn't reach Colombia or the United States fled south, overwhelming Brazilian border states and straining relations between Brasilia and Washington. By 2030, the refugee crisis had become the defining political issue in 5 South American countries. Governments rose and fell based on their response to the human tide flowing out of Venezuela. Here's the unexpected twist: some of those governments turned against American influence precisely because of the refugee crisis America's invasion had intensified. The BRICS alliance, which Venezuela had been courting before the invasion, accelerated its integration of South American members. Brazil, despite its own refugee problems, increased economic ties with China and Russia. Chile and Argentina explored alternatives to dollar-denominated trade. The invasion that was supposed to reassert American hemispheric dominance had paradoxically accelerated the search for alternatives to American hegemony. This is the pattern that imperial overreach always produces. Strength demonstrated becomes strength questioned. Allies who watched Venezuela fall began hedging their bets. Adversaries who watched America succeed began preparing countermeasures. The system responded to the shock by reconfiguring itself in ways that reduced American leverage rather than increasing it. Here's the second question to consider. If the invasion succeeded militarily but failed strategically, what exactly was accomplished? The answer depends on whose objectives you're measuring. American oil companies got access to 303 billion barrels of reserves. American military contractors got billions in occupation-related contracts. American politicians got a spectacular operation they could point to as evidence of strength. The Venezuelan people got an occupation that would last by 2036, 11 years, with no end in sight. And the American public got a bill not in dollars, since the oil revenues covered direct costs, but in reputation, in alliances, in the slow erosion of the international norms that had once constrained how powerful nations treated weaker ones. Let me close with one more trajectory. Gabriel Ortiz, the military intelligence colonel who disappeared into the resistance, spent a decade building networks that the occupation could never fully destroy. By 2030, his organization had conducted over 400 operations, not dramatic attacks, but targeted disruptions, sabotaged pipelines, assassinated collaborators, information campaigns that made American administrators paranoid about every Venezuelan they employed. By 2036, Gabriel is 57 years old, still underground, still fighting. His health has deteriorated. His family has fled. His life has been consumed by a cause that may or may not succeed. But he represents something the occupation has never been able to eliminate: the memory that Venezuela was once a sovereign nation, and the belief that it might be one again. The occupation didn't create Gabriel. It created the conditions that made people like Gabriel inevitable. Every invasion produces its resistance. Every extraction produces its resentment. Every generation that lives under foreign rule produces children who dream of liberation. This is the consequence that no military planner can prevent, and no oil revenue can buy off. It's not measured in dollars or barrels or casualties. It's measured in decades, in the slow accumulation of grievance that shapes politics long after the occupiers have forgotten why they came. Countries don't collapse in spectacular moments. They don't heal in spectacular moments either. They change slowly, painfully, one person at a time. And the people living through that change right now in 2026, as the occupation enters its first uncertain months, have no idea how their stories will end. But the patterns are visible to anyone willing to look. The patterns suggest that what's happening in Venezuela will continue to produce consequences long after the current administration has left office, long after the current generation has passed, long after anyone remembers the press conference where a president announced he would run a country he'd just invaded. The question isn't whether those consequences will arrive. It's whether anyone will be paying attention when they do. The question isn't whether those consequences will arrive. It's whether anyone will be paying attention when they do. And that question, the question of attention, brings us back to where you're sitting right now. Everything I've described exists on a timeline that extends backward and forward from this moment. The patterns didn't begin with Venezuela. They won't end there. And understanding those patterns is the difference between being positioned for what comes next and being overwhelmed by it. Let me show you the pattern one more time, stripped down to its essential structure. First, an official narrative emerges. In Venezuela's case, narco-terrorism, gang violence, stolen elections, threats to American security. These justifications contain elements of truth. Maduro was no Democrat. Venezuelan gangs did operate in American cities. Drugs did flow through Venezuelan territory. But the elements of truth serve a larger function. They provide moral cover for actions driven by different motivations. Second, economic pressure is applied. Sanctions, asset freezes, banking restrictions. The stated goal is to force change without military intervention. The actual effect is to push the target country toward alternative systems. Chinese investment, Russian weapons, BRICS membership, that make the original problem worse from Washington's perspective. Third, military action becomes necessary. The economic pressure didn't work. The target country is now more threatening than before. What choice do we have? The intervention is framed as defensive, reluctant, forced by circumstances. The years of escalation that created those circumstances are forgotten. Fourth, occupation produces its own resistance. Collaborators rise. Refugees flee. Underground networks form. The cycle of extraction and resentment begins. And somewhere in some back room, planners start discussing the next target. This pattern has repeated throughout American history. Guatemala, 1954. Chile, 1973. Panama, 1989. Iraq, 2003. Libya, 2011. The names change. The justifications evolve. The mechanism remains. Here's the first question to consider. If this pattern is predictable, why does it keep repeating? The answer isn't conspiracy. It's incentive. Each iteration of the pattern produces winners who benefit from its continuation. Oil companies get resources. Defense contractors get contracts. Politicians get victories they can campaign on. The people who lose the Adriana Moraleses, the families who flee the societies that fracture, don't have lobbyists. Their suffering isn't measured in quarterly reports. The system isn't designed to produce these outcomes. But it reliably does produce them because no one with power has sufficient incentive to stop it. Now, let me close the loops on the stories we've been following. Nicolás Maduro sits in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, awaiting trial on charges that could result in life imprisonment. His lawyers argue the arrest was illegal under international law, a sitting head of state, seized by foreign military forces on his own soil. The prosecution argues he forfeited sovereignty through criminal conduct. The legal questions will take years to resolve. The political facts were established in 47 seconds, the time it would have taken to breach his safe room door. Carlos Venegas returned to his water treatment facility 3 days after the invasion. American engineers had temporarily restored power, but the system was running at 60% capacity. He spent the next month training foreign contractors on equipment he'd maintained for 18 years. By the end of that month, he'd been offered a job with better pay and worse meaning. He took it. What else was there to do? Isabella Torres, the surgeon who operated by flashlight during the power outage, submitted her emigration paperwork 6 weeks after the invasion. By 2027, she was practicing medicine in Madrid, treating European patients, while Venezuelan hospitals remained understaffed. She told me she feels guilty every day. She also told me she'd do it again. I couldn't save a country, she said. I could save myself. And Margaret Chen, the executive whose firm made $23 million positioning for the invasion, recently gave a keynote address at an energy conference in Houston. Her topic, Opportunities in Transitional Markets. The audience was full of investors looking for the next Venezuela, the next opportunity to position themselves ahead of an event that would create winners and losers on opposite sides of an information asymmetry. Picture that conference room for a moment. Expensive suits, confident presentations, charts showing resource reserves, and political instability scores. Somewhere in those charts, entire populations are reduced to risk factors variables to be managed, rather than people to be considered. This is the system. Not evil people doing evil things. Rational people doing rational things within a structure that produces certain outcomes regardless of individual intentions. Margaret Chen doesn't think of herself as profiting from suffering. She thinks of herself as reading markets correctly. The suffering is someone else's department. Here's the unexpected twist that matters most: you are inside this system too. Every time you fill your gas tank, you participate in global oil markets that the Venezuela intervention was designed to reshape. Every time you check your retirement account, you're invested in companies that profit from exactly the dynamics this video describes. Every time you vote, you influence the politicians who make decisions about military force and economic pressure. You're not a passive observer watching events unfold on the other side of the world. You're a participant in systems that produce these events. The question is whether you participate blindly or with awareness. This brings me to the framework I want to leave you with. Not financial advice, I'm not qualified to give that, but 3 questions to ask yourself as you navigate a world where power operates the way we've described. First, what assumptions am I making about stability that might be wrong? Carlos Venegas assumed Venezuelan water systems would keep functioning. Adriana Morales assumed her call center job would last. Margaret Chen assumed the military buildup meant opportunity. 2 of those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. 1 proved extremely profitable. What assumptions are you making about the systems you depend on? Second, when I consume information about foreign policy, whose interests does that information serve? The narrative of narco-terrorism and gang violence served specific purposes. It provided justification for actions that were driven by different motivations. When you read about the next crisis, the next country that threatens American interests, ask yourself, who benefits from you believing the official story? Third, if the pattern I've described repeated in another country would, I recognize it in time to respond. The information was publicly available before Venezuela. Military deployments were reported. Sanctions were announced. The economic pressure was documented. People like Margaret Chen saw the pattern and positioned accordingly. People like Adriana Morales saw the same information and drew different conclusions. The difference wasn't access to secret intelligence. It was framework, the mental model used to interpret what was happening. Here's the second question to carry forward. What is the next Venezuela? Marco Rubio's warning at the press conference was explicit. If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit. Trump's threat to Colombian President Petro was equally direct. He has cocaine mills. He has to watch his ass. The template has been established. The justifications are being prepared. The question is where and when, not whether. I started this video with a paradox. The largest American military operation in Latin America since the Cold War was called a law enforcement action, an arrest. I end with a simpler observation. When a president can invade a sovereign nation, capture its leader, announce that America will run the country, and declare that American companies will extract its resources, all without congressional authorization, all framed as law enforcement, all watched like a television show, something fundamental has shifted in how American power operates. The shift isn't in the action itself. America has invaded countries before. It has seized resources before. It has installed friendly governments before. The shift is in the openness. They stole our oil, Trump said. We're going to take back the oil. No pretense of democracy promotion. No elaborate justification about weapons of mass destruction. Just resources, military force, and the announcement that cabinet members would administer a foreign nation. That openness is either refreshing honesty or dangerous precedent, depending on your perspective. Either way, it's a signal about what comes next. The people positioning themselves for what comes next are already 3 moves ahead. They're studying the pattern, not the headlines. They're asking who benefits, not what's justified. They're building resilience into their lives and portfolios against a world where the pattern keeps repeating. This video can't tell you what to do. Nobody can tell you what to do. The future is genuinely uncertain, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling something. But I can tell you what to see. The pattern is visible. The mechanism is documented. The winners and losers are predictable in aggregate, even if not individually. And the same asymmetry of information that separated Margaret Chen from Adriana Morales is available to you if you choose to look for it. We started with Maduro racing toward a door he would never close. We end with a simpler image, a map of the Western Hemisphere shaded by oil reserves and stability scores, with small dots representing people whose lives will be reshaped by decisions made in rooms they will never enter. Some of those dots will become refugees. Some will become collaborators. Some will become resistance fighters. Most will simply survive adapting to circumstances they didn't choose, participating in systems they don't control. The only question that matters is which dot you want to be, and whether you'll see the pattern clearly enough to choose before the pattern chooses for you. When a president watches an invasion like a television show, the question isn't what's on screen. The question is whether you're still just watching or whether you've finally started reading the script.